There we are. Well, we are now in chapter 7, and as we've said before, as we were working through this series, this is the point at which the book of Daniel changes. Now we're going to start getting into some really deep waters. Things are going to slow down a little bit, or quite a bit, in terms of our progress each week. But I hope this is going to be a blessing to you as we go through it. There's some pretty amazing things that we're going to look at. So if you want to go ahead and turn there, Daniel chapter 7. And before we jump into the text specifically, I want to spend a little bit of time working through the setup to all of this, especially since everything now is changing. We got to think about how we're now going to view what we're looking at going forward. John Walvoord, one of my favorite theologians, called Daniel 7 the most comprehensive and detailed prophecy of future events to be found anywhere in the Old Testament. This is really good stuff. And we got to remember, this is interesting too. We talked a little bit about this when we started the whole study of Daniel. Daniel 7 is written in Aramaic. The book starts out, chapter 1, written in Hebrew. And then as we talked about a long time ago, when we get to chapter 2, verse 4, the language switches to Aramaic. And that was where Nebuchadnezzar got this vision. That was the statue. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. He had that statue that was the prophecy of these different kingdoms. Switches to Aramaic when the Bible starts talking about that. Daniel stays written in Aramaic until we finish chapter 7, which interestingly enough is a vision that God gives to Daniel, and it's going to be a parallel to the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had with the statue. These visions are going to fit very nicely right next to each other, and right after we get that, then we're going to go back to Hebrew again for the rest of the book. Very, very interesting. So again, we need to remember how this book is divided up. Chapters 1 through 6, they are historical stories. And I hope it's been clear to you as we have worked through all of this, the theme that runs through the whole thing. The theme is that God is sovereign over everything. We've seen story after story, chapters 1 through 6. This is the main point for each of these chapters. But now we're going to get to the next section here, chapters 7 through 12. They're not the historical stories that 1 through 6 are. They are prophecies. Curiously enough, the theme is going to be the same. That does not change, right? God is sovereign over everything. But while chapters 1 through 6 are focused on history, these next 6 chapters are going to be focused on prophecy about the future from the perspective of Daniel. And we're kind of in this neat position today where a lot of time has gone past, and some of the stuff that was future for Daniel in this prophecy, some of these things have come to pass, and some of these things are yet to be fulfilled. All right? So that's the setup to this. I think this is pretty clear. But as we're thinking about it, or we should be thinking about it, don't miss the significance of what is happening here. Chapters 1 through 6 are linear. It's a chronology of certain events. Chapters 7 through 12 does not continue the chronology. Instead, it's going to go back in time, and it's going to focus on a series of visions that played out while chapters 1 through 6 were actually happening. All right? So Daniel had these visions, these dreams that we're going to work through the next 6 chapters while the first 6 chapters were occurring. And this is a very important arrangement because remember the purpose of miracles in the Bible. See this all the time, right? The purpose of miracles in the Bible is always to authenticate the messenger. God gives someone the ability to be able to perform this incredible thing in front of everyone else. People take notice and they say, wow, this guy can only do this through the power of God. Then when God gives that same person revelation to be written down that's going to become the Bible, they are authenticated. People say, okay, he can perform the miracle, therefore we need to listen to what this person has to say. That's what's going on. So chapters 1 through 6, we have this series of miracles, and Daniel is fully authenticated as God's messenger. And now with Daniel authenticated, we've got prophecy in chapters 7 through 12. This is the authenticated prophecy that we are going to start working through. And like we said before, it's kind of cool from a perspective of our time because a lot of this prophecy has already come true. But God has also given us some of this. He's going to help us understand what comes next. That's always a good thing. But we have to keep in mind as we work through this, the main purpose of these later chapters is the same purpose as the first half of Daniel, and that is to remind us or to teach us that God is in charge of everything. God is sovereign. God's plans come to pass regardless of whatever our plans are. So the prophecy part of it's important. It's important for us to understand future events for sure. Most of us find that very interesting. But and as we try to do that, it's important that we try to make sure our interpretations are correct. But as we're going to see when we work through this, some of these waters get pretty deep and some of this prophecy gets downright kludgy. And so if we're not able to nail down every last detail of the future prophecy perfectly, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I think that's okay. Because the main point here is that God is sovereign, not that we perfectly nail down every prophetic symbol in the book. Okay? Do not misunderstand me here. I've already said prophecy is important. Studying it and getting it right is very, very important. I'm not downplaying that. But I'm saying we need to focus on why God gave us the book and what it means. And so if we provide some perspective here, I'm pretty sure that someday we are all going to have to stand before Jesus and give an account of our lives, right? The Bible is clear on this. And so when that happens, when we wind up standing before Jesus, if in your life you have missed the main point of Daniel, of the book of Daniel, that God is sovereign, right? If in this life you have failed to grasp that point, to realize that God is the one who is in charge, not us, I think if we fail to learn that main point of this book, we're going to be in some serious trouble on Judgment Day, right? That's just not going to go very well. But on the other hand, if we work through these prophecies and we understand the underlying point of the book of Daniel, God is in charge, and we submit to that, and we work through these prophecies, and they're fascinating prophecies, but somehow we misidentify one of the horns of the fourth beast or something like that, and we say, well, I think it's this king, but we die and we go to heaven or whatever, we get raptured and we go to heaven, and we found out, no, that horn was really supposed to be this other king. I think when we get to the bema seat of Christ and we're judged, I am betting the consequences for missing that part aren't going to be all that severe, right? Not compared at all with missing the main point of the book, okay? So we're going to go really deep into these prophecies. Again, I'm not minimizing the fact that we have prophecy. We have a responsibility to interpret that. The Bible says we're blessed if we do that. We're going to do it, right? And it's going to get really hard. And I am going to be as open as possible on my confidence intervals in these things when we talk about them. And you're probably, well, if you're used to hearing me speak, this may not sound all that weird, but if you're used to hearing other people talk about these things, it's going to sound very different, because I'm going to be very clear of, very sure this means this, but over here, this is a theory, don't know that that exactly is what this means. And so it might sound like, as I'm going through this, like this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and that may be true, but I don't want to tell. I think there's too many people who pound the pulpit and say, this symbol means this, and we don't really know. We can make some good educated guesses about a lot of these things. Some things are very clear, so I'm going to be as clear in my confidence in the wording here as possible. And as we go through this, again, really deep waters, really cool stuff, we have to make sure we don't miss the forest for the trees. Book of Daniel, God is sovereign. God is the one who puts the kings on their thrones. God has made perfect plans from the beginning. It is his plans that come to fruition. This is the point of Daniel. Don't miss that as we go through all this and look at all these details. The book kind of naturally breaks up into 3 parts. We'll try to cover it in 3 weeks. We'll see how that goes. All right, let's jump into the text here. Chapter 7, starting in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. So we get a little bit of a good start to this. Verse 1 gives us some logistics here, talks about timing. And again, chapters 1 through 6, this was linear. We were seeing history play out across those stories in the first 6 chapters. Now we hit chapter 7, we're going back in time. King Belshazzar didn't reign very long. It doesn't look like. It's kind of hard to nail this down exactly. Maybe it was only about 2 years. So we know then that must put this chapter, Daniel 7, must take place just before chapter 5, where King Belshazzar dies at the end. So a year or two before chapter 5 takes place. Also note here, this is kind of interesting. Verse 1 can be a pretty difficult thing to translate. And look at this again. I'm reading from the NIV. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. So it sounds like the visions were a restatement of the dream, right? At least in the NIV. Daniel had a dream and visions passed through his mind. Like it's restating the same thing. I don't think that is a great translation because I don't think that's what the original language is trying to tell us. The King James says Daniel had a dream and visions of his head. That would probably be a better translation if you lived in 1611 and you spoke that way, but the of his head makes us think it's a dream where he's seeing a picture of his head. That's not what's going on. That's not what the King James is trying to say is going on. But again, language changes. So we got to be careful how we read these things. New American Standard, probably the best translation here. Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. These are different. Dream and the visions, these are referring to things a little bit differently. It's not just a synonymous restatement of the same thing. Here's what's probably going on. It says Daniel saw a dream, that's singular. He saw visions, plural. So Daniel saw a dream and he saw visions, multiple. And probably there's some layering going on. The dream here probably refers to the overall revelation. He had this dream, and in that dream there were multiple visions, and that was the different stages of things that he was looking at or that he was being shown. And so 5 or 6 times Daniel says, I looked at this thing, or I kept looking at that thing. So those are these different visions, these separate visions that all come together under the umbrella of this one dream. The dream is singular. It's made up of these different visions. Those visions come together to form a coherent message from God. And as we go through this book, as we have been going through this book, we've seen God communicating to people a lot through dreams and visions. And I tried to go back and look at the other dreams and visions and say, well, were these happening when they were asleep or they were awake? Can we nail down the language on this precisely so we could say, well, a dream is this and a vision is this other thing, but it really could not get that kind of precision in the wording. Back in chapter 2, it said King Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, plural. He asked his wise men to interpret his dream, singular. And so I've spent a couple hours on this and just reached the limits of my Aramaic competence, even with the tools at my disposal. There's lots of theories about this, but at the end of the day, I was hoping that we could get some kind of precision on the language that I don't think can be obtained here. But Daniel has this dream. It has multiple visions in it. And now, in verse 2, he's going to speak and he's going to tell us, or start telling us what this is. Daniel said, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. So right here, verse 2, from here on through the rest of the chapter, the whole rest of the chapter is going to be a quote from Daniel. For chapters 1 through 6, Daniel's writing in the third person. Now, chapter 7, starting in verse 2, it switches. Daniel is now writing in the first person. We saw in verse 1, Daniel writes down this dream. And again, the NIV really falls short here. NIV says Daniel wrote down the dream, and then we have this quote, and Daniel relates the dream. But if you read this in the New American Standard or the King James, it's clear the order is a little different. He had a dream. He wrote down the dream. Then he spoke a summary of that full account, and that summary is what gets written down as our biblical account, right? So what we're seeing here, this quote from Daniel, this is him speaking, this is him giving that summary, this isn't what he originally wrote down. And so that means, if you think about it, this is amazing. That means that somewhere out there, I'm sure, lost to the sands of time, maybe even just a generation or two after the time of Daniel, but for some period of time, there was this written account of this dream that God had given Daniel that had more detail, more information, and possibly some of his thoughts on all of that as well. And that existed for a time. And when you think about that, if you're like me, you could wish that you could wish that you could wish that you could find that text and read the rest of what he had written down and read the rest of what God had shown him. But of course, God in his wisdom knew there's only certain things that needs to be preserved and that people need to know going forward. And so that's the summary that he chose to account here. But it's a fascinating thing to think about. All right, so he has this dream Daniel sees. And what is he seeing? He's seeing this great sea churned, it says, by the action of the four winds. And it's the four winds of heaven. The winds, that can actually be translated as spirits or angels. So what he's talking about is he's seeing this sea, and there's this godly force that's churning up the great sea. And the great sea that he's talking about, probably the Mediterranean Sea, but that's not certain. It's very complicated. We will wade through some of that depth in the midweek. It's pretty fascinating, the underlying language there. But probably he's talking about the Mediterranean Sea here. All right, now we see the first beast starting to come out of the water. Verses 3 through 4. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. So first, Daniel sees these divine winds churning up the great sea, and now 4 beasts come up out of the sea, Godzilla style, and Daniel describes them. The first beast, he says, it's like a lion. A lion generally symbolizes power and strength. This particular lion has wings like an eagle. Generally, one would expect this to show that the beast is swift. Later on, he's going to tell us, we're not going to get to it today, but later on in the chapter, he's going to tell us these beasts are symbols of empires. And so the empire he's talking about here is the Babylonian Empire. And interestingly enough, I think this is a guess, but this is a very solid, educated guess that this is the Babylonian Empire that he's talking about. This is a lion with wings like an eagle. Both the lion and the eagle were symbols of Babylon back when Babylon was a thing. They used both of those animals to symbolize their kingdom. Jeremiah in his prophecies refers to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon as a lion. He does that in Jeremiah 4:7. Chapter 49:19, and chapter 50, verse 44. Ezekiel refers to Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, but when he does, he uses the symbol of an eagle. That's Ezekiel 17:3, and also verses 11 through 12 of that same chapter. So the kingdom referred to itself as an eagle and a lion. The prophets were referring to the prophecy involving this kingdom regarding other things, using those same symbols very clearly. I think this is low-hanging fruit for us here in our interpretation that this is Babylon that he's talking about. That part's easy, but we also notice here that Daniel said he sees this beast getting its wings ripped off, and also it gets lifted up so it stands upright, and it gets a human mind, or if you're reading along in another translation, it might say human heart. We'll talk about that difference in the midweek. I think mind is probably the better interpretation. The NIV wins this round. So here, when we talk about this, now we're really diving into the world of speculation about what these things are and what this is addressing. I'm pretty confident these 4 beasts represent the kingdoms that we're going to say, but when we start getting deeper into what's being prophesied about those kingdoms, again, my level of confidence in this starts to drop a little bit. The wings getting torn off of the beast, a lot of thoughts about this. It could be Nebuchadnezzar dying. because after he does, the whole empire just kind of goes into decline until it gets swallowed up by the next one. But then the whole him being given a human brain or heart, that's been suggested by many to have been referring to some of Nebuchadnezzar's humanitarian work, which, believe it or not, was a thing. But I think that would be weird because that happens after the wings get torn off, right? So if the wings being torn off mean his death, then he's not going to then be lifted up for his humanitarian work. So I think a better interpretation here, and again, this is an educated guess, but I think this works. The wings being torn off is very likely a reference to Nebuchadnezzar being driven to insanity and living like an animal back in chapter 4. But then he gets restored, remember, from chapter 4. So that's probably the part about the beast being set on its feet and being given a human mind or human heart. And I think this works because it fits with what we have read previously in Scripture. Also, linguistically, the wording kind of works when it says here, he was lifted up, the mind was given to it. It says, this wording here is written in what we call the divine passive, and we don't need to go any deeper than that. But the point is, the way it's written infers that these actions that are happening to the beast come from God himself. And that's exactly how we saw chapter 4 play out when the king went insane for a while, lived as an animal, and then was restored. So from the limited history that we have of this empire written in our Bible, I think that fits pretty nicely. But again, educated guess. All right, now we see the second beast here, chapter 7, verse 5. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. So now we have beast number 2. The second beast is like a bear. It's reclining on one side, and it's eating ribs, lucky bear. And it was told, go ahead and go out and eat all the meat that it wants to. And so the empire, this is referring to, most likely, again, very high confidence interval on this, it's talking about the Medo-Persian Empire here. And that empire was very powerful and fierce, just like a bear. They took out the Babylonians. But they're a little less graceful than the lion-eagle hybrid of the Babylonian Empire. And it's been suggested, and I think it makes sense, but again, we're reaching here. It's been suggested that the whole one side being raised up thing was a prophecy about the internal workings of the empire when that would happen in the future. Remember, this is the Medo-Persian Empire. It's an alliance between the Medes and the Persians. And as things went on with that alliance, history records that the Persians really came into their own and eclipsed the Medes, and it really was the Persian Empire, although the Medes were still playing a part. And so maybe that's what's being prophetically shown here about one side of the beast being lifted up. I'm not sure. I think all the theologians I was reading seem to agree on that. But again, that's just an educated guess. The ribs in the bear's mouth, there's a lot of speculation about what that's supposed to be. Couldn't find many people who agreed on what the different ribs were supposed to mean. I don't think we have enough information here to know for sure. I don't. And honestly, I don't think it's really important who the ribs are as much as it's important that the bear is eating ribs, right? The empire devours others. And as far as the bear being told to eat all the flesh that it wants to, again, this is the sovereignty of God at work. All right, this is the whole book of Daniel here. The bear is going to run around and it's devouring flesh, and it has been commanded to do that, right? That's the story of Daniel. We have these pagan empires operating throughout the book, and we see again and again that it is God who really calls the shots. That's what's going on with this beast, just like the others, just like with every single other chapter in the book of Daniel. That's the point of the prophecy. All right, so Medo-Persian Empire, pretty good fit here. We know that they did come along and they were as powerful. They were bear-like in their power, and they gobbled up their fill of flesh while God let them be in power. Verse 6, the third beast. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. So we have the third beast, leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. Pretty weird looking leopard, but there you go. And again, it was given authority, right? God's the one who's in charge. God is the one who causes these empires to rise. God is the one who causes these empires to fall. Probably this is talking about the Grecian Empire here. Alexander the Great comes along and they conquered the Medo-Persians, and they did it with great speed, just like a leopard. And curiously, a few years after they did that, it didn't take very long, Alexander the Great died, and the kingdom got divided up into 4 parts. So the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, pretty interesting. It fits very nicely with what came true years after this prophecy was given. Very, very interesting. That part is pretty clear. This is talking about the Grecian Empire, but not all of it is crystal clear. Like we said, some of these details can get a little kludgy, but this one's pretty straightforward. All right, now we get to the part that everybody's interested in. The most interesting part may be the 4th beast, verses 7 through 8. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. So here's the 4th beast, and it's the most frightening one of all. And unlike the first 3, Daniel doesn't describe the 4th beast as an animal. He doesn't. He describes some of the aspects of it, the iron teeth and whatnot. But he doesn't describe it as an animal. But curiously enough, much later on, John would also see a vision of this beast in Revelation 13. And in Revelation 13, verse 2, he described it as, the beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. So this 4th beast really kind of is a mashup of the first 3 beasts. It's assimilated the power of the first 3 beasts in the prophecy. And Daniel says that it is very, very powerful, right? It had iron teeth. It destroyed everything around itself. And there's this strange discussion about its horns. And this is almost certainly the Roman Empire that he's talking about, and it's almost certainly more than just the Roman Empire that he's talking about here. The Roman Empire definitely had iron teeth, and it destroyed everything around itself, and I think that's very easy to recognize. Well, let's talk about these horns. Daniel said this beast had 10 horns. And later on, in a couple weeks when we get to it, we'll see in verse 24, Daniel's just going to come right out and tell us that those horns represent kings. So we have these 10 kings, these 10 horns, and then this other horn emerges that we just read, and it's small and it's sort of insignificant at first, but then it uproots 3 of the other horns, and it becomes notable for its intelligence. It has the eyes of a man, and it also becomes notable for its boastful speech. And this little horn, my friends, is the first time that we see the Antichrist mentioned here in the Bible. First time this guy comes up. This is the man who Paul would later describe as the man of lawlessness, doomed for destruction. And there is a lot that we can say about this guy and about the horns. There is a lot that we are going to say about this 4th beast. However, we are going to save that for a later day. The last section of the chapter really dives a lot more deeply into the 4th beast, and it gets really interesting, and we will look at that in depth in a couple of weeks. But before that last section with the 4th beast, Daniel breaks, and he's going to talk about God. This is what we're going to get into next week. He's going to talk about God. He's going to talk about Jesus. And again, we'll look at that next week. There's one more thing I want to look at here this morning, and then we'll close this out. If you've been paying attention as we've worked through Daniel up until now, I am sure that you have noticed a big similarity between Daniel's vision here in chapter 7 that we just worked through and Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue from chapter 2. All right? Both of these were prophecies about these same empires, right? These two visions line up perfectly with one another. If you remember back to chapter 2, the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, it had this head of gold. And Daniel said, you king, that's you, that head of gold, that's your empire. That's the same thing as the first beast from chapter 7, the lion with the eagle's wings on it. Same thing that's being given in a vision from God. If we think back on the statue working down from the head of gold, we had the next layer down, which was chest and arms of silver. In Daniel's vision, that lines up perfectly with the second beast, the bear. That's the Medo-Persian Empire. Back to the statue, the next layer down, we have the belly and thighs of bronze. In Daniel, that's the equivalent of the third beast, the leopard with the 4 wings and 4 heads. That's the Grecian Empire in both visions, right? Statue, the bottom layer on the statue, legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. Roman Empire we talked about. And again, Daniel, the 4th beast, that super beast with the 10 horns plus the little horn, that's the Roman Empire plus more. So the parallels they're the same. I mean, it's different visions, but it's talking about the same thing. And the parallels actually continue, because if you remember back from chapter 2, long ago when we went through that, there were those different layers, which were the different kingdoms. But then part of that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, there was this stone that gets thrown by God that destroys the statue and turns it into a giant mountain, or the rock turns into a giant mountain. And we said, that's the future prophecy of Jesus. That's the picture of Jesus coming back to judge the nations and sit bodily on the throne in Jerusalem during the millennial kingdom. Right? That was the end of the vision in chapter 2. And again, that's also covered in the next section in Daniel chapter 7. This is part of Daniel's vision, his dream as well. We're going to talk about that next week. So chapters 2 and chapter 7 have these parallels in their vision. Succession of empires, Jesus coming back, God being fully in control happens in both of these visions. And we're going to see way down the road, when we finally get to chapter 8, whenever that is, we're going to see even more parallelism with a couple of these kingdoms, and we'll be introduced to 2 more beasts. We'll go ahead and put a pin in this for now. Appreciate you bearing with me on all that background, but I think it's very important that we level set on how we want to be reading this and what we want to do with the book. The details are important, they're fascinating, but don't miss the forest from the trees. God is sovereign. That's what Daniel is teaching us through this. All right, now if the gentleman will come forward, we will enjoy a time of communion together.